Good evening. Welcome to Empower You, and especially a welcome to you that have ventured out to come to the studio. This is our first class back in the studio for this semester, and it feels really good. I want to start off by the way, I'm Betty Overstreet, the Executive Director, and I want to introduce the rest of our board members. We have Jay Gronke, who's our producer, back in the back. We have Bill Roll, our treasurer. We have Ken Bowman, who's here, and Karen Cartier. Those are the members that are in the studio. Jill Google, who's our operation manager, is not here tonight. Bill Monier, Barb Horowitz, Joe Platt, and Nita Thomas are our other members that are not here. Empower You is a free university, but we're not without expenses. So we do accept donations. And if you'd like to give a few dollars to help our cause, there's 3 ways you can do that. You can give a donation when you sign up for a class. You can go to our website and give a donation. And then when you're in the studio, we always pass around our little red buckets if you want to give a couple dollars to help us out. Our speaker tonight would like for you to hold your questions until the end of his presentation. And next, Dan Reginald, who is the managing board member, I'm going to have him come up so we can give away our door prize. So get out your tickets.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Empower You Studio. So there is an Empower You Studio, right? It's so great to have you back. We are so glad to have you tonight, and we've got a double giveaway. We've got one of our guest books to give away in the studio, and then one online. We've got a big, huge online crowd tonight. Welcome, everybody. Maybe a few people are a little concerned about coming out the first time, but let's go ahead and pick the ticket for in the studio. You guys remember how this goes? And the number ends in 856 for Peter's book, 856. David, let's give David a round of applause. Congratulations. Thank you, Betty. So it's always exciting. We haven't been in studio for a year, so we've had our kind of shares of ups and downs. We installed a brand new camera. We were so excited about showing it to all the online people tonight, and it doesn't work, but that's how things go. And so for those of you out there that have been watching for the last year, and those of you, you know who you are, who send me little notes in the morning and little funny things, I really, really do appreciate it. I wanted to share with you just a couple that I saw. This one I'm going to send out to my son. I doubt he's watching tonight, but it's a movie clip. And hopefully I can get this to advance. Let me see here. Well, maybe I can't. I'll have to wait till the end on that. Jay, can you see if you can get that to go to the second slide on the screen? So we had no time hardly to get ready tonight, sorry. Well, we'll come back to that, everyone. Let's see if we could do that real quick. We'll come back to that. So I wanted to go over with you. Our official drink of the night is Pepsi, and also Diet Pepsi. And if you're new to the studio, so we do have a backup camera working for everybody. You'll see my favorite image of all time. And that is the famous 1997 image from Steve Jobs at Apple. And I think Apple kind of went a little bit upside down this year, so I decided to make that a kind of a prime feature of the studio. So a few things I wanted to tell you about. We've got some great sessions coming up. Janice Heisel from a former writer at the Inquirer will be here on Thursday night to talk about her book, Submerged. It's going to be a great, great story. My wife and I we watch Dateline nonstop. If she's on tonight, she knows. And we had taped probably 100 of them. And lo and behold, there were 2 about the Ryan Widmer murder that I had to watch over the weekend. And it's a great show. And the only thing I want to ask Betty is, Betty, for Thursday night, I want to get that tub where she died right here. Can you arrange that for me?
I'll try.
And it's going to be a great story. It is a fantastic story. Nancy Brenneman, a tax accountant, will also be here at the beginning of the class to talk about some last minute tax tips. Tuesday night, we have a great class that I hope you can come to. This is next Tuesday. And that is a class. It's going to be, we're going to go empower you on the road like we used to do a long time ago. It's going to be in Oakley. It's going to be at the historic Century 20 Theater. And one of the best speakers I've ever heard speak, Bob McCune, who's a former 6-time congressman, will be talking about foreign influence and trade policy. And that'll happen starting at 7 o'clock. You can also watch that virtually. And that'll be a great talk. Then next Thursday night, it's a class I'm really passionate about sharing with you. I've been really studying Winston Churchill for a long time. And I'm going to be doing a class on Churchill. I started to get interested in him when I did a class on a guy by the name of Charles Krauthammer 3 years ago in 2018. And Charles Krauthammer said about Winston Churchill that he was the most important person of the 20th century. And it made me think, how could one person be so important that they could have that title? And was it really accurate? Time magazine had come out and named Albert Einstein person of the 20th century. And Krauthammer said, it's not true, it's Churchill. So I've taken a great look at his life. And I'm going to talk to you about probably what may be one of the most important political decisions that was ever made when I talk to you about his life next Thursday night. I hope you'll join me. It'll be a fun session. I've got a required reading. I'm sorry, the PowerPoint's not working. We'll see if we can get that going, but I've got a required reading and it's on empoweruohio.org. It's an article. If you get a chance, read it. It's an important article. It's called "The Equality Act is a War with Reality." And what it talks about is the freedom of rational human beings to use common vocabulary when they're speaking about what you can see. It blends right into a class we're having on April 29th with a guy that's right back there in the studio. You'll see his picture, by the name of Jordan Peterson, who is an academic from Canada, who a few years back started to be told he couldn't use certain words, and the Canadian government started to outlaw those words. These exact same things are happening in the United States. You can see it just happen. This article, which you can read on the website, "The Equality Act is a War with Reality," and that's an act before Congress right now. You should know about it. So let me think if I've got anything else I need to tell you about. I want to introduce our guest, and I did have one other email that came into me. It was a cute email. It was from Deborah G. And she said she had sent us some money for one of our guest books. And she said, "Would you permit me to add a little bit more money onto what I sent you so that you could ship my book to my 91-year-old husband?" Yeah, I think we could probably do that, right, Peter?
Yes, absolutely.
That's a cool thing. So Peter has spoken at Empower You before, a great class when we talked about the media, and he had a lot of great reflections on it. I think you can watch that class on Empower You on the archive. If you go to the archive tab, I think you can watch it. But he's been one of my favorite writers ever since he was at the Enquirer, when I would start to have I'm sorry. I apologize, Cheryl. We're just a little bit out of sorts. But before Peter comes up, we're gonna have Cheryl Pop is she runs Honor Flight Cincinnati, and I got a note from her the other day. She's talked about that before, and She told me the bad news that Honor Flight had not been able to take any flights during the pandemic at all. I knew she was coming tonight. I wanted her to come up for a couple minutes and just give us a quick update on that. Could you give Cheryl a round of applause?
Hello, everyone. Thanks to Dan and Empower You for giving us a few minutes to catch up before the main event. Forbidden Fruit is going to be way more interesting than this. But we had, everybody in the lockdown has had, their share of stories, but those from the veterans will never be able to be told, a lot of them. We had 4 scheduled flights in 2020 and 2 spring flights this year that were postponed. So that's a total of 500 veterans and didn't get to make their trip after they qualified. The qualified veterans have been waiting and waiting and waiting, like all of you, to get back to their normal lives. And this is a treat that they only get once in a lifetime. So with their advancing age, and the unavoidable happened. We lost a lot of them. So we'll never be able to make that up to the special veterans, but we do have an idea for 2021. And if everything goes all right and the creeks don't rise, as they say, we'll be able to, we have 3 flights scheduled, August, September, and October of this year. But we're starting a new program called Flags of Our Fathers. And what it will be, the details will be on our website shortly. We'll be able to take a picture of the departed veteran with us on the trip and feature a picture of him so that his family will have that to add to his legacy. We regret that the family members couldn't go and the veterans couldn't go. So, but we'll never forget them. And we have the good news is American Airlines has been overwhelmingly supportive of Honor Flight. And they've given us, we had 2 flights prepaid and they have moved those back. They've rescheduled it 6 times now. So they're probably using our money for gas. But anyway, they've been very, very conscientious of how much money it takes to raise for the veterans. And then there was rumors of our demise. I had a couple guys call me from the VFW. We heard you shut down. We haven't shut down. We're busier than ever. The veterans didn't go away and we haven't spent any money. So we're in really good shape for the next year and we plan to continue. We've had virtual fundraisers and there's some things coming up on our website. Instead of telling you all about it, all of them, because I don't want to take any more time from Peter, but I've left brochures out in the front and the American flag masks are for sale also. But if you want up to the minute news, you can sign up on our website, honorflighttristate.org. Check and recheck, because as soon as we have any news, we put it on our website. Thank you very much. Dan?
Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl. What a great thing. So about our guest tonight, Peter Bronson, author of Forbidden Fruit and several other books, was the editorial page editor and columnist for the Cincinnati Enquirer for 20 years. Under his leadership, the Enquirer was judged best editorial page in Ohio 4 years in a row. Before coming to Cincinnati in 1992, he was the editorial page editor and columnist at the Tucson Citizen in Tucson, Arizona. He started his career in Michigan after graduating from Michigan State University in his hometown of East Lansing, Michigan. He has served on several nonprofits, including Casa de la Gnosis, Home for the Abused Children in Tucson, Northern Kentucky Children's Home, Leadership Cincinnati, Cincinnati Right to Life. He was a regular panelist on Channel 9. He's been a contributing editor and columnist at Cincy Magazine, and now is the owner and publisher of Chili Dog Press LLC, which offers publishing, writing, edition, and consulting. His 2005 book, Behind the Lines, The Untold Stories of the Cincinnati Riots, was a bestseller. He's the co-author of The Legacy of Courage, True Stories of Honor Flight Veterans. He's an active group leader of his church. He enjoys working on old sports cars, playing golf, and travel. He's a father of 2 and lives with his wife, Kathy, in Milford. We're so glad to welcome back Peter Bronson.
Thank you, Dan.
Welcome.
And thank you, Betty. And thank you for all of you for showing up tonight. I guess we're the brave ones, or the ones who are willing to get out here and about and actually attend these things in person, which I think is a great sign of a comeback from the Chinese virus, if I'm allowed to say that. I'm going to tell you a story here tonight. I did, as you noticed from my bio, I didn't grow up here. So I didn't grow up with the information or the story about the Supper Club. I kind of caught it
Let me
secondhand.
sneak in. Let me sneak in there.
I moved here in 1992 to be an editorial page editor at the Inquirer. And so it was all new to me, but I set out to write this book because I figured there is no story bigger than the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire. I wonder how many of you who are here tonight knew somebody who was affected by that fire? Just raise your hands. Yeah, we have a few. Were any of you family members who were at the club or survivors?
PowerPoint's out on the screen here.
Because I have met so many people who were survivors and who were at the club that night or just before the fire or not after, that's for sure.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and take a tour through the history of the Beverly Hills Supper Club, but even better, the history of Newport, Kentucky and Sin City. I set out to really write about the Supper Club, and as I opened the doors, they just kept leading down further hallways, and this way and that way, and doors would open. And I was astonished at the amount of corruption, the pervasiveness of crime, of every evil you can think of in Sin City, Northern Kentucky.
Okay. Do you want me
And
to-
it shocked me, really. I was not prepared for it. I did an FOI request for the FBI, writing down key words, and they sent me 4 discs of declassified information. And on those discs, for example, were the transcripts of secret illegal wiretaps by our Attorney General, who was Bobby Kennedy. And he had known sources or informants and wiretaps in the rooms of the leading mob figures in the country at that time. And so these transcripts of conversations were absolutely fascinating. And the place where most of these that I read took place was at the Desert Inn in Las Vegas, which was owned and developed by Mo Dalitz, who is a leading figure in this story, who was the big mob boss for the Midwest. He was the leader of the Cleveland Four. So let's take a look here. Whoa, we jumped way ahead. Let's go back. I'm gonna take you back here. And okay, many of you probably saw pictures like this one. There we go. At around the time of the fire. You're not seeing it? Are we up yet? We're having some technical difficulties. Okay. Well, let's back up a little bit and I'll talk about something else before we can get to the pictures. I had a lot of surprises as I was working on this book. One of the surprises to me was how closely connected little Newport, Kentucky, that we know today as a pretty clean town, how corrupt it was, how the mob controlled everything. I mean, they controlled the police, the county attorneys, they controlled the city attorneys, the lawyers, the prosecutors, they controlled all the judges, they controlled all the way to the governor's office, and it was even all the way to the White House because Red Masterson, who was their top hitman, the enforcer for the mob in Newport, had a close friend who was in the vice president's office in Washington, D.C. The control of the mob was beyond belief. It really shocked me. And it went on, it continued from the 1930s, actually all the way back to the 20s when George Remus was the nation's biggest bootlegger, but he was really small time compared to the mob that followed him. And all of the casinos, the bust out joints, the really fancy carpet joints, all of those things were created and run by people who are in George Remus's gang as bootleggers and drivers. These guys did prison time with George Remus. They came out of prison in the 30s and they set up their clubs. And after that, they ruled Northern Kentucky up until about 1936, when Mo Dalitz came down to visit Northern Kentucky and he saw the Beverly Hills Country Club, which was developed by one of the leaders of George Remus's gang, who was Pete Schmidt. Pete Schmidt had built by far the prettiest carpet joint in the Midwest. It was considered the showplace of the nation even back then in the 30s. And it was known from coast to coast. It had the leading entertainers of the day. And when Mo Dallas saw this place, if we get to these pictures, I'll show you some pictures of what it looked like. It was gorgeous, and he decided he had to have it. So what he did is he made an offer, as they say in The Godfather, I'll make you an offer you can't refuse. And Pete Schmidt refused him anyway. He was a hard-headed former gangster himself, and he looked every bit the part of the gangster, and he said no. And the next thing you know, there were bombs that went off on his property, and then it was burned down. And a 5-year-old girl was killed in that fire, and that was the first fatality on top of that hilltop that we know of. How we doing back there? We're struggling? Okay, just a second. So what we do is we follow, I'm going to take you through these pictures to follow this history that begins in the 1930s with this first fire. The guys who actually set the fire were a bunch of what they called in headline speak at the time, police characters, meaning hoods, thugs, gangsters. They were all had police records. They were all underworld characters from various parts of the US, but mainly from Newport in Northern Kentucky and Cincinnati. And they went out there and poured a bunch of gasoline into the bottom of in the lower level of the Beverly Hills Country Club and threw in a match and set it on fire. And one of them was severely burned. And he was finally captured by police in an attic. When they caught him and captured him, he said he was raving with his injuries and didn't know what he was saying, but he said, "I've never killed a child before." So at that point, he was already haunted by what had happened. The little girl died of her injuries almost like immediately after the fire. And that was a bit of a step too far, because at the time, everybody was making really good money off the mob casinos, and they had brothels. They had so many brothels in Northern Kentucky, they needed one-way streets for the day traffic and the night traffic, believe it or not. And they had bootleg booze. They called them tiger traps and tiger lounges or speakeasies, you name it. And they had bootleg booze all over the place. It was a wide open city. Gambling, you could find any game you wanted. Murder, and even as late as 1957, Newport's murder rate was 5 times the national average per capita. And those are just the ones we know about. Because what the mob would do to take care of people was they'd give them what they called a Newport nightgown, which would mean they would take you up to one of the bridges, usually the Brent Spence or one of those, and they would wrap you in chains. The suspension bridge was another popular location, and pitch you over the railing. And if you'd already been shot, say in the back seat of a car, they would drive the car onto a barge and then take it out in the middle of the river and push it off into the river, which prompted one investigator to say to me, wouldn't it be interesting if they could drain the Ohio and find out what's at the bottom? I suppose by now, most of that stuff is down by Louisville because of the floods. So they burned Pete Schmidt's club and they started taking over everything in Northern Kentucky. At the time, the biggest competitor was the Lookout House, which was also a really beautiful carpet joint, as they were called. I mean, just first class all the way, top drawer entertainers. I mean, we're talking about Frank Sinatra. Dean Martin got his start at the Beverly Hills Country Club as a dealer. He and Jerry Lewis actually started their act together at some of the seedier clubs in Newport, where they started doing comedy together, and that's where they launched their career. So they had fantastic talent right on up through all these years. And the big change that happened was in the 1960s. And what happened there was that run for sheriff. He, excuse me, he was a star football player. I mean, top notch all the way. He was one of the best athletes in the country at the time. And for those of you who know your sports, he played backup behind Johnny Lujack, who was a Heisman Trophy winner. And his coach at Notre Dame said that actually George Ratterman was the better athlete. George Ratterman went on to have a pro career in football. And then he injured his knee and he came back to Cincinnati, where he went into business as a stockbroker. And at one point when he was living in Fort Thomas, his neighbors he learned about this Committee of 500. And this was an organized drive, campaign by the good citizens of that region to clean up Northern Kentucky and to push all the gambling and the mobsters out. Well, George Ratterman was talked into running for sheriff. And probably a lot of you have heard the story about April Flowers in the upper room. Well, April Flowers was a stripper. Her real name was Juanita Hodges. And she was hired by a guy named Tito Carinci. We're good to go with pictures? Okay, right now we're showing nothing on this screen. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, I'm going to kind of stop there with George Ratterman because we're going to catch up to it. I'm just going to go through these quickly because I've covered a lot of this. So this is where the investigators going through the ashes and remains of people the day after the fire. And they used every fire department on both sides of the river to fight this blaze, and there was no way they could stop it. Many people died in this fire running back in to save other people. It was just so tragic, and their stories are in the book. Here the investigators are going through the remains were gathered at St. Elizabeth Hospital. They had entire boxes full of eyeglasses, wallets, car keys, shoes, purses, you name it, credit cards, pictures of their children. It was so touching and random the way people they would look completely normal, and then the half of their body would be burned completely beyond recognition. The fire was so intense. It was unbelievable. Some of you have seen this monument that was put up by one of the survivors, a real hero of the blaze named Wayne Dammert. He was the banquet captain that night on the second floor, and he saved 75 people by leading them to safety out of the second floor. His story is in the book, and he is a legit hero. He also set up this monument to the survivors, and to this day, he is still one of the most dedicated people to keeping alive the memory of the people who perished and the families who lost their loved ones and the survivors. So this is what the old Beverly Hills Country Club looked like when Pete Schmidt owned it. It was a totally classy joint. This is actually a postcard that went all over the country because people who were coming to conventions in Cincinnati knew all about Northern Kentucky, believe me. This is Pete Schmidt. I mean, this guy looked like a gangster from Central Casting, right? Well, here he is having a conversation with the police in Newport. And you can bet this is a very friendly conversation because he owned the police in Newport. This is the interior of the Beverly Hills Country Club as it would have been seen by Mo Dalitz when he came down from Cleveland to see it for the first time. And you can imagine why he said, I've got to have this place. It was doing gangbuster business. This is the headline from the Inquirer on the night of the first fire, the following day. These are the guys who actually set the fire. Dave Whitfield on the left was the most mob connected of the bunch. The other guys were pretty much thrown to the wolves, and they agreed, they pleaded guilty early on because they were obviously so guilty. Dave Whitfield really was one of the ringleaders, and the mob actually paid 2 lawyers to defend him through 2 trials. And then he finally did go to prison also. But when he got out of prison, he immediately got a job with the mob managing one of their clubs. This is a guy who should have a statue in Northern Kentucky. His name is Judge North Johnst with an ST. He was the first to stand up and say, enough, I've had it with this crime. And it was right after the fire when the citizens were outraged at what happened to that little girl. That was just too far, too much. And this guy fought the mob very courageously. He was quite a character. At one point, the mobsters accused him of carrying a machine gun to raid some of their clubs. And he said, machine guns were discussed, but I only carried a handgun. That was some judge. This was the rival to the country club, the Lookout House. As you can see, another postcard, very fancy, classy place. And when you go out on the town in Cincinnati, this was where you went for weddings, for anniversaries, for proms, for anything, any chance you had to be in a first class place. These were the destinations. This is Red Masterson, the enforcer. Nobody knows how many people he killed. In one instance, there was a hitman who came from Chicago looking for Red, and he pistol whipped a cab driver to help him, to make him lead him to Red Masterson. Well, the cab driver never did find Red, but Red found the hitman. And he walked across the street when he saw him in broad daylight on Monmouth Street in Newport and had two 38s. And he emptied the 38s into this hitman in the backseat of that cab, and that was it. And when it was over, there were no witnesses. They couldn't find the guns, and the charges were dismissed. And I guess they didn't send any hitmen after Red for a while. Red was a tough guy, a very scary guy. When he made an offer for the Lookout House from Buck Brady, it was another of these mob deals where the Cleveland mob said, we're taking over the Lookout House. And Buck Brady, he was another tough guy from Remus's gang. He said, no way, I'm not doing it. Well, and Buck was so tough, he decided he was going to go after Red first. So he drove by Red's car and opened fire on him with a shotgun. He hit Red in the side of the face. Red fell out of his car. Buck got out and ran and was finally caught hiding in an outhouse about 5 blocks away. Red was taken to the hospital and said he didn't know anything. He didn't recognize anybody who shot at him, and that there was no problem. It was just an accident or some kind of mistake. Well, Buck quickly realized, if you don't kill Red, you better make a deal. And he did. He immediately sold the Lookout House to the mob. That's a picture of what the Beverly Hills Country Club looked like in the 60s. Those of you who know your cars can see that's a 1960s, early 60s Cadillac. And this is what it looked like. This is a night at the country club, isn't it? Wouldn't you guess that's Hyde Park Country Club or Nacatewea or you name it, Cincinnati Country? It was really first class. This is the next place that Pete Schmidt built, named after his son, Glenn, and it was called Glenn Schmidt's Rendezvous. And then it got the name, which I always thought was the best name for any of these places in Northern Kentucky, the Playtorium. Because Northern Kentucky was Cincinnati's adult playground. And Cincinnati had a really kind of good symbiotic relationship because they kept everything clean north of the river. And I mean, they really kept it clean. There was a guy named Machine Gun Meldon who worked for Cincinnati police, who was known to have notched up many a gangster on the butt of his machine gun. He carried a Thompson. That was his favorite weapon. And at one time, some gangsters made some threats at him, and he offered to meet him on the streets in Newport at a date certain at a precise hour, and none of them showed up. So Cincinnati was like double tough about making sure none of these gangsters came across the river, but Cincinnati also kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink, sold Northern Kentucky to get convention business. Because who didn't, back in those days, in the 50s and 60s, nobody took their wives on conventions. So when they're selling conventions to the Shriners or whoever, they're all like, Northern Kentucky, wow, you know, I can have some fun there. And it was a huge draw for Cincinnati, and probably this trump card for competition. If somebody was looking at a convention between Cincinnati and Columbus, they're coming to Cincinnati. So the Playtorium was another place that was owned by Pete Schmidt, and then he was pushed out of that by the mob too. He was kind of like their developer for a while. He'd build places and they'd come take them from him. This is how pervasive corruption was. This guy, Big Jim Harris, also known as the Boss Man, was the marshal of Wilder, Kentucky. And he had the biggest brothel, one of the biggest brothels in Northern Kentucky. And he had a racket going where he would run tapes, and he trained the ladies who worked for him to ask key questions. So they'd ask something about where do you live and do you have children, and you know, this kind of thing. And he would tape it all. And then after they'd gone home back to Chicago or, you know, Louisville or Detroit or someplace, he'd call them up. And all he had to do was play the tape. And they would pay anything for that tape. when Big Jim Harris was finally arrested, he said he had $167,000 in his mattress that he collected from this so he could pay for his legal defense. And he did beat the rap for a while, but he finally went to prison and later on opened up one of the sleaziest, rottenest clubs in Northern Kentucky during the 70s. It was called, I'll get to it in a minute, we'll have a picture. In the 1950s, some of you may recall the name of Estes Kefauver. He was a senator from Tennessee, and he launched his career on finding out how pervasive is organized crime in America. And he led this traveling show from city to city to city, even smaller towns, but he would go from city to city and hold these hearings, and they would compel these mobsters to come in. And one of them right there who was forced to testify is Mo Dalitz. That is the guy who had the territory of Michigan, Ohio, and all of Kentucky. Mo Dalitz was big time. He was every bit as big as Meyer Lansky or Sam Giancana or Trafficante. He was big, big time. Bananas, you name it. Nobody was bigger than Mo Dalitz. He came out of the Purple Gang, which was considered even more vicious than Murder Incorporated. They would do anything for money. And he was actually raised in Michigan and Detroit and got his start bootlegging across the Detroit River into Canada to bring bootleg Canadian whiskey. This is where I stopped earlier. Here's George Ratterman's football card. And he was set up, taken out for drinks by this guy in the middle, Tito Carinci, right there in the headline. There's a picture of the woman and the man in sunglasses. That's April Flowers and Tito Carinci. Tito was a mobster all the way. And Juanita, also known as April Flowers, was put in bed with him. He was slipped knockout drops and put in bed with her, and they ripped his pants off. And then they had tried to hire a photographer to show up and get pictures of them together. The photographer backed out because he knew what was coming. And so they had people on their payroll at the Newport Police Department who answered the phone and came right over and arrested George Ratterman. All this was during his sheriff's campaign because he was running as the reformer to clean up the mob. Well, it backfired because George Ratterman was smart enough to hire a lawyer who sent him immediately to go get a blood test. And the blood test showed huge amounts of chloral hydrate in his blood. And it was then at that point, the press got totally onto the story. It was made one of the biggest stories. This story went around the world. It was that big. And it was all about the fact that the mob had tried to frame this guy up and it backfired. Well, at about that time, Ron Goldfarb, who is on the right in this bigger black and white picture with George Ratterman, he was an assistant U.S. Attorney General for Bobby Kennedy. And he went to work one morning and he was told that Bobby Kennedy had just been reading the headlines about George Ratterman, and he said, "You're going to Newport." He sent Ron Goldfarb to go to Newport with a blank check to go after the mob. And this is where Bobby Kennedy figured this was his chance to really nail the mob, because they were going to go after him for civil rights violations for what they did to George Ratterman. Well, to view this in the bigger context, remember, Bobby Kennedy and his brother Jack, who appointed him Attorney General, were thought to be in the pocket of the mob because Sam Giancana in Chicago bragged openly about getting Jack elected with election fraud. So when Bobby Kennedy sends Ron Goldfarb to go after the mob in Newport, at that time, Newport was the headquarters of wire betting for the mob nationwide. So he was going right to the heart, their most vulnerable spot. And when he did that, that was considered by the mob to be an unbelievable betrayal. Vendetta is the word they use for that, the grudge that they carry for that kind of betrayal. And there's only one solution for that kind of vendetta, and it's blood. Here we see Bobby Kennedy going after Jimmy Hoffa, who was very deep into the mob and was using the Teamsters pension fund as basically a bank for Mo Dalitz in Vegas to build these casinos and hospitals and golf courses. And Bobby Kennedy and Jimmy Hoffa hated each other with such a passion. There were several points where they nearly came to blows, and they each swore that they would get the other. And in many ways they did. Bobby finally did put Jimmy in jail, but to do it, he had to use illegal, unconstitutional wiretaps and all kinds of shortcuts through the justice system. Jimmy Hoffa can be heard in transcripts that I found talking to the big boss in New Orleans, asking, can we kill Jack Kennedy? And he wanted to kill Jack because he figured we could kill Bobby, but then Jack as president would come after us. So he said, let's kill Jack. And we could do it in an open car in a southern city. Those were his words. Here's Jack. All the time Bobby is fighting this gritty war in the streets of Newport with the mob. Here's Jack, the glorified Camelot, Jack Kennedy. It was just such a contrast of two Newports, two Kennedys. Here's Jack coming to Newport, Kentucky when he ran for president in 1959, actually, during the fall campaign. Notice he's in an open car. I mean, this is just, it has such a sense of irony, this picture. Here he is going to Newport, which ultimately is, in what I could find, was very directly linked to his undoing and his death and his assassination in an open car just 3 years later. And you'll notice looking at this picture, this was a very common thing that politicians would ride into town in the back of a convertible sitting on the back, and they'd be followed by their press, the buses and everything. We don't see that anymore, do we? We haven't seen that since 1963 in Dealey Plaza. It just doesn't happen because of what happened. So this is when George Ratterman fought on, battling the mob. Here he is serving a warrant on Screw Andrews, who was the new big mobster in Newport at the time. And while he was serving that warrant, the Newport police ticketed his car. That's how bad the Newport police were. And here we are of what I call the period of disorganized crime. So when Bobby Kennedy and George Ratterman made it too uncomfortable for the mob, the big mob in Newport in Northern Kentucky, they went out, they flew off to Las Vegas. Out there, they could buy anybody. They had the money. They had the political connections. They basically bought everybody all the way into the governor's office. In fact, in those same transcripts where they're talking and they're being recorded on wiretaps by Bobby Kennedy, they are actually talking about how much they're paying to buy the lieutenant governor of Nevada. They owned everybody. And they obviously figured out going into politics was a really good way to just shortcut everything and get rid of the heat. So what Mo Dalitz once said, and maybe some of you have heard the quote, everything I knew to build my empire in Las Vegas, I learned at the Beverly Hills Country Club in Southgate. So when the big mob left, the small mob took over and it became a porn empire. Newport, in those days, for those of us who remember, the 70s were a dark time. And there were sin strips in every city. This was all caused by Supreme Court decisions that basically handcuffed any city from establishing standards of decency. They ruled that nude dancing was a form of artistic expression. It was ruling after ruling. And the big surprise to me was that the city of Newport valiantly fought the Supreme Court, all the way to the Supreme Court in many cases over and over, to win control back of their city so they could push away the porn. But for years, the porn in Newport was like no other place except Times Square, maybe. I mean, some cities probably had it as bad, but Newport was really bad. This is a picture of Dick Schilling, who bought the abandoned Beverly Hills Country Club in the 1970s. So he decided, he had the Lookout House before that, and he built his empire on restaurants, and he decided this was really the place that had the best story. It had the name, it had the reputation, all the history. Everybody across the nation knew of it. So he bought it, and he said the name alone was worth every penny I paid. Started remodeling it, and halfway through remodeling it, it was torched. There's no question it was an arson. The local fire chief was called 3 minutes before the blaze was reported by somebody who said the Beverly Hills Country Club is going to burn. Sure enough, when they went in there to investigate the fire, they found empty gas cans sitting in the middle of the floor, and none of the construction workers had any idea where those came from. It was torched halfway through construction. And that was the second fire. Here we go to the third fire in 1977. Here we have the flames coming through the roof in the cabaret room. We have volunteers and firefighters and rescue workers trying to they're carrying away people on cots. It was just a horrific, horrific scene. The descriptions by the eyewitnesses, the people who worked there, the people who survived, are really heart-wrenching. And those are verbatim in the book. Here's the guy who saved an awful lot of people. You probably heard of Walter Bailey. He was a 17-year-old kid who was working as a busboy. And when the zebra room in front of the house went up in flames, he was the first to realize this was bad news, and he ran into the cabaret room. Now, I was talking to somebody earlier tonight who was there like just before the fire, and they were talking about how the chairs were packed so tight you could not even get in and out of your seat. You were basically trapped, and people observed, oh my gosh, what if a fire started? Nobody would get out of here. Walter realized that it was totally a fire trap. He ran to the stage where a comedy team was performing before John Davidson could come on. And he ran up onto the stage and in a quite well spoken and self-possessed voice said, "You need to leave. The exits are in the back. Everybody get out. There is a fire. You need to get out of here right now." And some people listened. A lot of people, of course, on a nightclub, they'd been drinking heavily. They laughed it off. Some thought it was part of the comedy act. The comedy guys, Teeter McDonald, realized he was serious, and they got out of there as fast as they could. But a lot of people just didn't pay attention, and this was a situation where split seconds meant the difference between life and death, escape and never making it out. So Walter Bailey saved an awful lot of lives that night. Immediately, the next day after the fire, it's very curious that the zebra room where the fire started was immediately demolished. As you can see from this picture, the first place the clamshell is going is that zebra room. Now look over on the right, that big gap in the front of the building, that's the zebra room where the fire started. The Kentucky State Police said for years and years that there was no evidence of a fire in the basement below the zebra room. A couple of guys who were survivors who worked there fought legal battles for years, and finally, through freedom of information requests and lawsuits, they pried loose some of the photos that the Kentucky State Police had taken that they refused to release. Now, probably 60% of those photos have disappeared and will never be found. They were destroyed, we think. But they did recover these, which clearly, very clearly show evidence not only of a fire in the zebra room, but of an explosion back there in the HVAC air handling equipment. You can see the scorch marks. You can see the scorch marks on the wall. You can see part of that ducting there that is blown wide open. There's a close-up to show how badly it was burned. This is where the Kentucky State Police said there was no fire. The things that compelled me and made me arrive at my conclusions, I leave it to the reader. I present the evidence and I leave it to the reader. But this is some of the things that I found that I think are just beyond a doubt evidence of arson. Every year in Northern Kentucky, a nightclub or a major restaurant was burned, and nearly all of them were arson. Look at this, 1970, Beverly Hills burned during construction, and the Galaxy Club, formerly the Stork Club, the Cabana Club 71, the White Horse in 72, the Lookout House in 73, the Brass Ass in 74, on and on it went every year. And they would find, not only would they find evidence of accelerants, but in many cases, people had seen the owners carrying out their liquor supply the night before. These places were being deliberately torched by the mob. It was all back to the same old racket. You either play with us or we burn you out. Here on the right is an FBI memo that I obtained It describes a man who came into the FBI office and described a flight he was on in which two guys from a small town in Kentucky talked about torching the Beverly Hills Supper Club. And this conversation took place 2 weeks before the fire. And he described them in detail. He described how they had some inside help and that they were boasting about knowing who Dick Schilling was and that he was a mobbed up guy and the supper club is going to burn. So he went to the FBI with it. As far as I can tell, the FBI never followed up on this. Criminal evidence includes things like a threatening letter to the Schillings. One of the Schillings families came home the night of the fire and had a letter in the mailbox that was composed of letters clipped out of a magazine that said, we burned you once, we'll burn you again. You keep building, we'll keep burning. Doesn't get more clear. The damage to the air handling equipment. There were several reports by witnesses that I interviewed for the book who were there that day, who worked there as a waitress and a busboy, who saw two men working in the air handling and ceiling of the zebra room that day. And they were busy, so the guys were very hostile and said they were working on air conditioning. However, there was no air conditioning and there was no air conditioning ducts for that room. Those same witnesses described a crew that included some children who were brought along and had been playing while the adults were working, and the adults were wiping down the walls in the Hall of Mirrors with some milky white substance, which could very well have been an accelerant. We have a firefighter's testimony, was a police captain for Cincinnati FD, who was there at the club with his family that night. And he went back in to try and see what was going on with the fire. And he saw the fire come down the Hall of Mirrors, making its way from the zebra room to the cabaret room where most of the people were killed. And he said, I've never seen a fire move like that without an accelerant. So we have expert testimony. We have the FBI tip. We have busboy David Brock, who is very close to the Schillings. His first person story that Dick Schilling came to him immediately after the fire and said, David, they burned me out. We also have two witnesses who said they saw two guys come into the bar at the supper club and make an offer, including a blank check to the Schillings saying, just fill in the numbers, we want the club. And they said they threw them out. Well, they came back. This is a little bit of Beverly Hills Country Club memorabilia, a short list. It's not even begins to scratch the surface of the famous entertainers like Marilyn Monroe, Phyllis Diller, Don Rickles, Jerry Lee Lewis. And then this menu is signed by Ozzie and Harriet Nelson from the original Beverly Hills Supper Club. Actually, that goes all the way back to the Country Club. And there's the book. I'm selling full color signed copies here at $20, not $25, because you don't have to pay any shipping and handling, and I'll be glad to sign one for you. And they are color. If you buy it, you can buy it on Amazon. You can also buy it in local bookstores, including Roebling Point Books in Northern Kentucky, Joseph Beth Booksellers in Rookwood, and Amazon, of course, and I think there's a couple other bookstores that I'm not thinking of right now. So I encourage you to get it and read it. It's a fun read. I had so much fun writing this book. I was actually sad when I actually had to come to the point to pull the trigger and publish it, because the research was just as much fun as the writing. And so at this point, I'll be glad to take some questions. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true that they did blame it on that. That is the media narrative. There's some really interesting things about this whole story that almost could be told again today. But one of them is the media narrative. Once it's set in stone, it never changes. So what happened is Stan Chesley was among the first people on the scene, and I've got pictures of him in the book pawing through the ashes. And he actually was the first to file a class action suit. And he persisted to the point where he had basically exhausted all the deep pockets defendants, because they all It didn't work. His first trial was dismissed. He got a court of appeals to get by one vote to let him go back and take another bite at the apple. And the expert witnesses all said there was no way aluminum wiring caused this fire, but he showed sensational pictures of burn victims and appealed to the emotions of the jury, and he got a verdict. And ever since then, now the official story has been that Stan Chesley proved it was aluminum wiring. Well, I'll show you in the book places where we have witnesses who say there is absolutely no way that was it. One of the fire investigators said aluminum wiring was the cause du jour in those days. Everybody wanted to say that was, but as a matter of fact, you're correct. That's the story, and he made his fortune on it. But now we need to look more recently at what's happened to Stan Chesley and find out what kind of character did this man have. He has been disbarred in Kentucky and Ohio. He's been accused of heinous manipulation and mockery of the justice system for his own enrichment. And I don't think his reputation can sustain that story anymore. And it's time for people to realize that the people who actually were the survivors, more than one of them told me, he told them, just shut the blank up because there's no money in arson. So.
Questions, please use the microphone. Hold on, please, just a sec.
I had heard that the doors were padlocked and chained. Is that true?
No, it's not. The truth is that there were some, a lot of furniture, chairs, that the people were packed in like sardines to the point where waitresses had to walk across tables to get out of there when they were running for their life, because there was, the aisles were completely clogged up. The exits, the two exits where people tried to get out in the back of the cabaret room, where huge clots of people died right there, they were cluttered with unused chairs and bar equipment. And in some cases, they were so poorly marked that one of them, an exit sign looked like it was an exit, and it wasn't. It led to a closet, and several people died in there. So the place was a fire trap. It was extremely irresponsible the way Dick Schilling built it. He built it in pieces whenever he had the money. He would overrule his architects to do it his way. It was a fire trap all the way, but no, the doors were not padlocked.
Here's a question right here.
I was just going to say, we remember dating and just being married going there, and that's why we quit going, was because it was so crowded. But my question was, we had heard, I don't know if it was you or someone else that maybe was researching that, that the cover-up went as far as the governor of Kentucky at the time?
Oh, absolutely. I have no doubt. If you look at the blue ribbon panel that he appointed to investigate the fire, not only one of those guys was not involved in a huge scandal of corruption in the ensuing years. And we're talking about huge scandals. Governor Julian Carroll was also involved in a huge scandal of corruption while he was governor and then later. There's a book called Bluegrass Conspiracy if you want to see what was going on in Northern Kentucky in those years. It's a shocker. Plus, the people who were fire investigators, the fire marshal who was there to investigate the possibility of arson, he was told by Governor Carroll the minute Carroll got there, shut up, it's not going to be arson, it's an accident. He had no way of knowing that until you do the investigation, but they made sure that the zebra room where the evidence was immediately destroyed and covered up. And yes, I believe that the cover up and the corruption went all the way to the governor's office.
First name is Jim.
Hi, Jim.
Just curious, how did you arrive at the title?
Oh, that's a good one. I toyed around with a lot of things and I had several working titles, but Forbidden Fruit really hit me because this is a story about how the government overreached with prohibition, and it pushed and pushed and pushed till people had to break out. And when they broke out, they opened the door for anything, because to get their bootleg booze, They would come across the bridges from Cincinnati on the weekends because Cincinnati was dry on the weekends and Kentucky was wide open. They would come across in traffic jams to get their booze. They would drive for miles to get their bootleg booze in Northern Kentucky. But when they stopped for their bottles of bootleg hooch for Christmas or an office party, they're walking into clubs that had bar girls and hookers, and they had illegal games, bust out games. They had crime you wouldn't believe. So all of this, you don't just get to pick one thing when you open the door on evil. And when people decided that they were going to get even with prohibition by opening the doors on this, they took a bite of the forbidden fruit. And it's a little bit of a obscure maybe, but the title just fit for me.
Yes, I'm Michael Patton. I remember hearing a year or two ago about some people who are trying to have the site re-examined, a dig to look for arson. Can you talk briefly about that?
Sure. Some of you may be aware of the battle for development there. They're talking about putting on assisted living and various types of mixed community housing there on the top of the hill. The hill today is, unless it's been bulldozed, was really set up by Wayne Dammert with signs in the woods that showed where the cabaret room was, where the Empire room was, where the Zebra room was, and you could walk through there and you could see where these things happened. It was pretty cool. There's a chapter 2 in my book. This is a little bit of an aside, but where I interviewed a woman who was a paranormal investigator who went up to the top of the hill on several occasions and made these recordings of voices and paranormal disturbances, which is no surprise. If there's any place that's going to be haunted, if you believe in those things, that's going to be it. But that was an especially interesting chapter. But the development battle as it stands right now, I'm not sure exactly where that is, but one of the hopes of the people that are in favor of that, who are among the survivors, is that when they excavate for this assisted living and this new development, they will get a chance to maybe excavate around the Zebra room and get in there and see what they can find. If they can, with modern forensics, who knows, there may be some way to find new evidence.
Peter, we've got some online questions for you.
Sure.
Peter, we have somebody online is asking regarding the child who was killed in the first fire. Was it customary at the time that children would even be at an establishment like that?
That's a good question. I should have clarified that. She was actually staying with her sister, who was staying with her boyfriend, who was the caretaker for Pete Schmidt's club. The club was closed. It was in the wee hours of the morning, and it was just the three of them there. They're kind of the people who were involved that were there with the little girl changed their stories a couple times. I think they were pressured by the mob to zip it. But yeah, she was staying overnight with her sister, and the boyfriend, when they realized that they were trapped in this burning building, threw her out the window into a snowbank. It was in the January, and she died of burns and the fall. Yes, sir.
Hold on just a minute, Ken.
Okay, I have, I guess, first a comment and then a question. First, the comment. Thanks for doing this, writing your book. I went to my high school, Boone County High School senior dance at the Lookout House.
Oh, great.
Marvelous place. Never did go to the supper club, but my dad and stepmother were married at Beverly Hills back
Wow.
in 1973.
So many memories of that place.
So I know the Schillings by name, didn't know them personally. What happened to them after Beverly Hills Supper Club? They did I think a floating restaurant in Newport at one
They
time.
did. They
Can't
had
remember
the
that, but
islands.
that's the last I heard. The
Yeah,
islands,
they
right?
had the islands. They also had a couple of restaurants in downtown Cincinnati that were quite the thing for a while in the disco days. Dick Schilling's insurance paid out a humongous amount for this fire. He did restart, and he actually made it back to fantastic success in the South as one of the fathers of casino gambling in the southern states. And that also is very curious because given one of the theories about why this place was torched, it really does fit in. I'm not going to tell you more than that. I don't want to give everything away. I want to make sure you buy the book.
Peter, we've got some more online questions.
Sure.
Peter, yeah, this person is not sure if they missed it or if you mentioned it, but they're curious who was performing the night of that fire.
It was John Davidson. I don't know how many people here remember John Davidson on Hollywood Squares. He was the guy every mother loved, John Davidson. He was so clean cut. He got his start as an underwear model for catalogs. and he had this perfectly coiffed hair, and he was the kind of like wise guy on Hollywood Squares who would make up these convoluted answers that sounded so plausible. Everybody believed he was telling the truth, and he had that earnest, clean-cut look, and then yeah, and his dimples. Yeah, he was very
questions.
popular. So many people drove miles and miles to see John Davidson. He was a real heartthrob.
So Peter, you are perfectly free to decline to answer this. You might get a chuckle out of it. Somebody is wondering if the Inquirer ever asks you to do a guest column, and if you would do so if they did.
Well, funny you'd ask, because they did contact me just a couple of weeks ago and asked me if I would contribute to a retrospective on the riots of 2001. And I did. I wrote them a short column, about 500 words, which is not even really column length, but it was fun. And I told them, handle with care, if this is going to get you in trouble, and by all means, don't print it. But it looks like they're going to go ahead and print it. So it's like one of these is not like all the rest. Well, my column is not going to be like all the rest.
Can I put one of our guests on the spot here? I don't know how
Sure.
she'll feel about this, but Susan, our friend Susan, was there the night before. Is that right, Susan? Could you give a few reflections on what it was like and how great John Davidson was?
Well, I was a huge John Davidson fan. We had a poster on our bathroom door, if you needed to know. And Walter can verify this as well as I can. When we got there, everything was fine. But the more people who came, they put more tables, more chairs. And even at one point, Walter said, if ever there's a fire, we can't get out, because it was just every square inch was filled. Is there any?
Well, I'd like to bring up something. The aluminum wiring, our house was built in 1970 in Beacon Hills, and all the houses there had aluminum wiring. Now, all these years I've worried, because to me, the supper club fire was aluminum wiring was the cause.
Mhm.
And I've always thought about that. Just from that, even though it was wrong, that stuck with me all these years.
For sure. It would give you a sleepless night. And I got to say, nobody was a greater self-promoter than Stan Chesley. He sold that story to the media, and shame on them. They bought it and let it run because he was the big noise in town, and everybody wanted to get on the bandwagon. He was bringing all this national attention. But you go back and look at his track record now, and it's just shameful. I think when he was disbarred, the Wall Street Journal called him the crook of all crooks, a disgrace on the law profession. They just didn't even pull any punches. And I think that's really the legacy he's left with.
More questions online.
We have a person who is curious if you know whether any of the mob was ever convicted.
Good question. Yes, in a lot of cases, these guys were sent to prison. For example, Sam Giancana went to prison for a stretch. Jimmy Hoffa did some prison time. Generally, they would clam up and they wouldn't give you much. One thing that's curious about Sam Giancana is he was directly implicated in the assassination of Jack Kennedy. If you look at the way these things connect. So was a guy named Johnny Rosselli, who was a Hollywood type mobster, really tough guy from Chicago. And so was Jimmy Hoffa and one other mobster whose name is after Kennedy was killed, Roselli got in trouble and he started talking to the FBI about what happened. And Giancana was in prison at that time, and some of his mob friends thought he might be turning on them. And within about a 6-month period, all of these guys were hit. Sam Giancana was shot in the face in his house while he was cooking pasta. Johnny Roselli was found in a oil drum floating in Tampa Bay, right around there, or just off Miami. And they were all killed. And Jimmy Hoffa, we still don't know. But it was like cleaning up just to make sure nobody talked. There's an old mob saying that two can keep a secret if one is dead.
For all those online tonight, we've got a great audience online. Thank you. We didn't get a chance because of our technical difficulties to tell you to get your chance to win the book. Just go down to the Q&A section and put your email address in, and we'll choose one of you to win the book. Peter, when you were writing the book, did anybody try to ever discourage you not to put in any part of the book or anything in it?
Well, being a publisher who's worked with a lot of authors, and in fact, Janice Heisel's book, Submerged, that was my company, Chili Dog Press, that published it. So I can highly recommend it. She's won a national award with that book, and I think you'll love her presentation next Thursday. So I was aware, having seen how these things can work, that I had my book, I did a legal review. So I had the premier First Amendment lawyer in Cincinnati, Jack Greiner, read the book and reviewed it for me. And I made sure that there was no problem there. As far as what else, most of these mobsters are gone. As far as I know, Mo Dalitz became the premier philanthropist. He was known as Mr. Las Vegas when he died. He was one of the most popular, beloved men in Las Vegas because of the hospitals and the golf courses and the donations he'd made with mob money. Mob money that he skimmed from the Desert Inn and his casinos, and money that he took out of the Teamsters pension fund. But it is incredible to see that guy that you saw up there, who is nothing but a cheap hood from the Purple Gang, turn into the most beloved philanthropist in the city of Las Vegas.
We've got a few more questions online, Peter.
Sure.
Yeah, someone is asking if it's believed that there's any chance that more evidence, could be uncovered in a new excavation. They're wondering if anybody could still be held accountable. And I think you said maybe a few people have, but they're curious if there's likely any more evidence to be found.
Well, I can't say there isn't, because we don't know what kind of modern forensics could be applied. We've seen like the Dateline shows where the cold cases are dredged up. There's an interesting one going right now. In my book, there's a story about a guy called the Eggman. And he was the Eggman because he had a little general store in Persimmon Grove, Kentucky. And he would come up to Newport and go to all the casinos and bust out joints and brothels, and he would sell eggs for $100 a piece. And the deal was, buy my eggs or I'm a constable and you could get in trouble. Well, he disappeared just before one of George Ratterman's big rallies, and his body was never found. And there's a cold case being investigated in Kentucky right now by one of the Kentucky State Police detectives who's become fascinated with this, to try and find out what happened to George Hawkins, the Eggman. And I'm involved in that. In fact, we're doing an interview with a Louisville TV station in a couple of weeks to talk about it. So that's kind of exciting. These cases, they're never closed. You're talking about 165 people. And if that was arson, as one of the people says in my book, it's the biggest mass murder in US history. 165 people, which doesn't include, by the way, 4 to 5 unborn infants with women who were pregnant on the night of the fire. So yes, there's always a chance that this could be.
I'm sure a number of people might be wondering this. Somebody has asked, what is Walter, the hero, doing now? Did you have a chance to talk with him at all?
Well, I can tell you an interesting backstory about Walter Bailey was that Jeff Ruby, whose restaurants are very popular here in Cincinnati and Louisville and around the Midwest, Jeff Ruby was there sitting in the front row the night of the fire as a guest of the Shillings. And he said, Walter Bailey saved my life. I never would have made it out of there if Walter Bailey hadn't announced that. And so after the fire, Jeff Ruby hired Walter Bailey to work in his restaurants and then put him through college. And Walter Bailey now, as last I heard from Jeff, Walter Bailey's in Texas, where he's become quite successful as a businessman. And for all I know, maybe has restaurants of his own. But yeah, it's a great story of somebody paying back and showing their gratitude.
Any more questions in the audience tonight? I know we have a few more online. Anybody have one right here?
While he's getting there, I'll mention something that was also a little bit of a surprise when I began putting all this together. Okay, things you're going to find, and then I'll ask you at the end, does this sound familiar? Corrupt FBI director, spying on the president, CIA involved in domestic politics, illegal wiretaps by the Department of Justice, and a coup to remove a president. This all happened in the 1960s.
Some things never change.
It happened in the 1960s too, I should say.
I just have a comment. My wife and I were supposed to have been there that night, but fortunately, our son, who was 2 years old at the time, came down ill, so we were unable to go. But ever since then, she and I call it the Beverly Hills syndrome. We have not been in this building ever, but every time we go to a new facility, the first thing we look for are where are the exits.
I believe you. In fact, that's one of the things I learned from talking to Wayne Dammert too, the guy who saved 75 people on the second floor, is always look for the exits. Don't ever take a hotel room on the third floor or the second floor if you can be on the first floor. Make sure you know where you're going if you have to, because those people that were trapped, they had no idea, and no hope really.
Jay, more questions?
Yes. Is there any, you may or may not want to answer these about your book. I know you don't want to give too much away, but somebody's asking if there is anything in the book about the Kennedy assassination, and another person wonders if John Y. Brown's name ever came up in the investigation.
John Y. Brown is in the book just as an example of the corruption of Kentucky governors is unbelievable. I mean, Ohio's nothing to shake a stick about. I mean, there's a few there too in the closet, but yeah, John Y. Brown only comes up as an example of how Kentucky governors have been corrupt for a very long time, and Julian Carroll set the mark way higher or lower, as the case may be. And as for the Kennedy assassination, yes, I do get into that, and I have transcripts from the National Archives and from the FBI that show these conversations of who wanted to kill the Kennedys and why. And it totally changed my mind about what I thought was, I mean, basically, I don't think the Beverly Hills Supper Club was an accident, and I don't think Oswald acted alone. You just have to look at the evidence, but make your own mind up.
Here's another question right here.
Was it ever thought of that the Schilling sons could be involved in any way?
The Schilling sons were really in some ways quite heroic. They were very hard workers. One thing you can say for the Schillings, for all the corners they cut and the mistakes they made and the way that contributed to that Holocaust that night, was that they were extremely hard workers. And the Schilling sons worked as hard as anybody. And that night when the fire started, they really acted courageously to try and save as many lives as they could. So, and I think one of the arguments by one investigator was persuasive when he said, well, would Dick Schilling be involved in setting this fire? And he said, his entire family was working there that night. His wife, his daughter-in-law, his sons, and his brother. I mean, they're all there. So how would you set a fire that would put your own family in danger? I don't buy that. So
Jay, one last question.
Yeah, somebody is wondering, they know that you mentioned that from the early to mid 70s, almost every year a club burned. Did the burning stop after Beverly Hills? And if so, was it just because it was such a horrific event?
Yeah, they did. As far as I can tell, that was the end of it. In the 70s, late 70s, there were constant battles between elements of good and evil. Pro-porn people, believe it or not, there was a party in Newport that was pro-porn. And they said that the strip clubs and all these sleazy places were actually, it was the Highlight Club was one of the worst. There's a story in there about the bust in there that would just curl your hair. But that these places were the best economic development Newport could hope for. And then there was another faction that came along that said that we're business owners and like the heirs of the Committee of 500 who said, no, we can do better than this if we want it out of here. And they battled back and forth with kind of one side gaining the upper hand and back and forth. One little footnote on that is the guy that ran Cinema X was a big time porn dealer throughout the Midwest, a very crooked mob guy. And when they finally busted the Cinema X, which had the absolute worst movies in it in Newport, they found that he had cameras behind the screen. And he was taking pictures of the people that were coming to his theater. And in those pictures, when they went through it, they had police, prosecutors, judges, doctors, lawyers, VIP, the who's who of Newport. So the corruption is so insidious for those who say, well, if you don't like porn, just, don't look at it or, we have a right. No, what you're doing, again, like forbidden fruit, once you open that door, you're bringing in all kinds of things that you didn't want. And in this case, there was extortion, there was ugliness, the slavery. They had motorcycle gangs that were caught trafficking in what they called at the time white slavery, which was taking young women across state lines and forcing them into prostitution. And it was just ugly all around.
Well, we've got you here. Any thoughts about the big CBS News story with 60 Minutes that happened a couple nights ago?
Well, my faith in humanity is somewhat restored to see actual Democrats defending the governor of Florida, and also Publix. They've got some courage for a change to see a corporation stand up and say this is not true and it's a travesty. I have been disgusted by 60 Minutes for decades now. The stuff they've perpetrated, the lies, the hoaxes, the stupidity. And it's just one of the more salient parts of the whole media fake news empire.
Now, how many years ago was it you left the Enquirer?
That was 2009.
I've always felt like we readers, when you left, got a really bad deal because you got to retire and we got Eugene Robinson. And I can't think of a worse deal
That is
in
a
the
bad
history
deal.
of Cincinnati than
I had
than
nothing
that.
to do with that.
I hope. But let's give our guest a round of applause.
Thank you.
So good. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Dan. I'll be out there signing books.
yes, and I want you all to give yourself a round of applause for surviving the masks. Thank you. You did it. Just a couple things before we go. 3 ways to buy the book. You should buy it. I can't wait to read it. You can buy it right out in the hall. For you people who are online, we had so many people respond to the giveaway. We'll have to let you know who won in a day or two. But you can go to Peter's website,
However you want to do it.
which is Chili Dog.
Actually, I only take cash and check. I don't have a credit card
Jay, could you
machine.
turn off Peter's mic, please?
Cheryl's a lot better at
Thank you.
that.
You can go to Peter's website, number 2, chilidogpress.com, and there's $5 shipping fee. And if you have trouble negotiating that, just make a donation to Empower You today or tomorrow for $20, and we'll have a book for you here that you can pick up at some point when you can get to Empower You Studio. A couple things I wanted to go over with you. I wanted to thank Peter for donating 2 books tonight. I wanted to thank Jude for helping check people in tonight. Let's give Jude a round of applause. I wanted to say sorry about the little technical problems we had in the beginning. Progress has its issues, and we've worked on the sound. I think the sound is better, and we're going to have a brand new camera on Thursday night that I think will be great for online people. So with that said, I also wanted to let you know there's one other person who frequently talks at Empower You, Dr. Jay Rissover. He was an employee of the Beverly Hills Supper Club that night. I don't think he was working though. But with that said, thanks for coming tonight. Go out and empower you, and we'll hope to see you Thursday night. Thank you, everybody.